Okay, can you hear me all right? Now, hopefully you can see the map here of North Shropshire. In the right-hand side, we've got Nantwich, which I admit is in Cheshire, but still the border is very close. Market Drayton, Whitchurch is sort of in the middle. Oswestry down in the bottom left, and Ellesmere is between Whitchurch and Oswestry. And if you look down the A49 from Whitchurch, you come to Priest and Priest Green, the centre of the primitive Methodist universe in the area. I want to look at the time span really of about 1820 to 1850. And a lot of what I want to talk about will be centred on what became known as the Priest Green Primitive Methodist Circuit. Now, before I begin, I'm no expert in this, so I ought to disclose some of my sources in compiling this information. First of all, there is the Primitive Methodist website, which has been really quite invaluable for details. Then there was a PhD thesis by Delia Garrett in 2002 on primitive Methodism in Shropshire. That's been very useful. I think it was through Leicester University, and it is available online if you want to Google it. I've had various odds and ends picked up from the internet in general, and the editions of the Primitive Methodist magazine. Our Primitive Methodist forebears were very good, I think, at propaganda, if I can use that word, and advertising themselves and telling their own story. The book by the Reverend H.B. Kendall, The History of the Primitive Methodist Connection, has been useful, and so has a local booklet produced in 1926 from the Priest Green Circuit entitled The Story of 100 Years. I do think that I've been able to find out a bit more about the really early history than was in the booklet, but the booklet is helpful for some slightly later updates. And I should also mention some local sources. There's a chap here in the town of Wem, which is on the map, and it's sort of really at the bottom, Tom Edwards, and what he doesn't know about local history, well, he knows everything and has been an invaluable source. And I think he was actually an invaluable source for Delia Garrett when she did her thesis. So that's the area, that's the time span, those are the sources. I think it is time to launch in. Now, I don't think we can understand what happened here all those years ago unless we understand a little bit of the social and historical background at the time. So I hope I don't bore you, but maybe one or two things just do need to be said. We're talking of the early years from the 1820s onwards, and we're talking about a religious revival. Primitive Methodism was. It was very much, I think, a revivalist meeting in the early days with the open-air preaching, camp meetings. And that led to the establishment, of course, of many societies, preaching places, and perhaps a generation later, really, they got into chapels. If you look at this as a revival, you find that after perhaps 2 generations of it, things really had settled down. Primitive Methodists were no longer breaking new ground in that sense. They were settling down behind their pews and pulpits and settling into chapel life in general. Now, religious revivals need the right circumstances for them to happen. They have to capture the public's imagination. The times must be right. They have to actually offer the public something that people actually want, I think, to put it bluntly. A vision of a better life, social improvement, and give hope and dignity to people. So that in mind, it's worth asking the question, who lived in this rural community around here? What were their lives like? What were the changes taking place? I guess we all know that these were the times when Britain was emerging from the Napoleonic Wars. We got rid of that little chap in France, that little upstart who'd been marching around Europe, and now the way was open for Britain to establish its worldwide empire of domination. Yes, okay, enough said about that. But the end of the Napoleonic Wars changed a lot. It actually brought quite a recession, economic recession in Britain, There were quite a few ex-troops, ex-soldiers, homeless, rootless people wandering around. Industrialisation was proceeding rapidly, leading to the growth of urban areas. Canal systems and toll roads were bringing food and raw materials into the towns and cities for new industry, and they were taking manufactured goods out into the rural areas. But something else was going on, I think, which perhaps is not quite so easy to quantify, but the old certainties and the old structures, even of rural life, which went back to medieval times, were beginning to come to an end with many changes. We think of the Industrial Revolution as affecting towns and cities, but it actually affected rural areas too. Much of the land was still owned by big aristocratic estates, and the aristocracy would then rent out land to tenant farmers, who in turn would employ agricultural labourers, domestic servants and other workers. And some of those tenant farmers were wealthy with secure tenancies, and others were really barely better than the labourers whom they employed. But there were improvements going on in agriculture. It had to, in order to provide food for the new urban areas. There were new farming methods coming in, clearance of woodlands, heaths and wetlands, and of course, enclosure of common land. Now, I think enclosure of common land had a greater social effect in the south of England than it did in the North Shropshire area, where a lot of the land had become enclosed a few generations before. But country life, rural life was changing. New occupations were needed. Not only did you have agricultural labourers and farmers, but you needed your blacksmiths, your wheelwrights, your farriers, and many more. We all know about the problems of industrial cities and bad housing, but what perhaps we don't realise is that housing in rural areas was worse, basically. The reason why people flocked into the new industrial towns is for a better standard of living, in fact. The rural labourer typically lived in a 2-up, 2-down cottage which was in disrepair, with windows broken, if they were there at all. A small cottage in which they had 6 to 8 children. The family would probably also have a small vegetable plot to grow some food and perhaps keep chickens or pigs. And these dwellings were cold and damp, and infant mortality rates were higher actually in the countryside than they were in urban areas, which I find is very surprising. Education in the early 1800s was left to the family. If the parents were literate, and usually the mother in this case could read and write, children would be taught, but many people were illiterate, although levels of literacy were increasing in general. Even by 1850, half the population in Britain was rural. Now, that's just a little bit about the background, which I think is important in explaining how things happen. So let's get into it. Now, last month, at the end of the Zoom on the Saturday, I left you with the challenging question of what was the link between Waterloo and the Llangollen Canal and primitive Methodism in North Shropshire. And I will now try and answer that link, because I know you've all been waiting and doing your research over this last few weeks. We've got some pictures up here of the Llangollen Canal. And on the left, you see a picture of, I suppose it would have been the toll house. And this is where the priest's arm of the canal takes off. The canal in front of this house is sort of a Y-shaped fork, and the priest's arm goes off to the right. And to the left, that goes off through Whitchurch and eventually down to join the Shropshire Union Canal at Hurleston outside of Nantwich. The priest's arm of the canal was opened in 1805. It was due to go to the village, well, the town, I don't know if you call it a town or a village, or priest really, but it never got there. It got as far as a place called Brook in 1806, and then they ran out of money. But the whole purpose of these canals was that they could bring coal into rural areas. They could take food out of rural areas to feed the new towns and cities in the Manchester conurbation and that. And of course, they brought limestone from the quarries in North Shropshire up at Pant and Llangollen. And lime was very much needed to improve fields. It would be crushed, well, it would be calcined in a lime kiln, of which there's many, many lime kilns along the canal, old lime kilns this is, and then spread on fields. And of course, even today, you spread lime on fields to overcome the acidity of putting an awful lot of manure on fields, so it is still needed. But it actually was the way in which you could increase your rural productivity. The canals brought other things too. They brought new ideas, they brought new people. Communications was certainly being improved. Ideas, things were changing in the 1820s. You'd had the American War of Independence, which must have been a bit of a slap in the face for the British Empire. But more than that, it brought Republican ideas and different ideas of politics. Then you'd had the French Revolution. And you'd had books like Thomas Paine's book on the rights of man in 1791. They were all feeding ideas that the old order could be changed. The old order of medieval Britain, as it were, was giving way. 1819 in Manchester, you had the Peterloo demonstration, which had called for political reform. And in the south of the country, you had the swing riots of dispossessed agricultural workers as their land was taken away by the new enclosures. And of course, this was the era of the Chartist groups who were calling for a charter of basically political rights. And whilst Chartism as a movement didn't succeed, it sort of petered out, the things they stood for eventually did succeed. And some of those Chartists advocated violent revolution. And there was the great story of the Newport rebellion, really. And as Welsh miners came down the canals into Newport armed, and there was a big shootout with government forces. And at the end of it, a lot of people were killed. And then you had the Monmouth trials when they put them all on trial, and so a lot of them got deported for that. Something else, in 1834, the Poor Law was changed, and this ended outdoor relief for poor people, which was quite benevolent, particularly if you're well known in your community. You could do quite well out of Poor Law relief, and the workhouses with harsh conditions came in. Such were the times. Such were the times when primitive Methodists and their preachers emerged into this community. So we go now to our next slide. And this is about the Cheshire mission. And it's about a man called the Reverend John Wedgewood. On the left-hand side, we have his gravestone at Brownknoll Chapel, which, Brownknoll is sort of Broxton way. It's on the road from Whitchurch to Chester. Now, John Wedgewood did come from the Wedgewood family. He was a friend and associate of Hugh Bourne. And in 1817, John Wedgewood became a travelling preacher who led a mission westwards from the Potteries, the birthplace of primitive Methodism, into Cheshire, and started to evangelise in some of the Cheshire villages. These early primitive Methodists had a great technique, you see. They'd walk into the village, they'd stand in a prominent position, and they'd start singing. And having started singing, they would gather a bit of a crowd. And then when they gathered a crowd, they could start, waving the Bible about and preaching. Now, if I started singing, I'm afraid people would just scatter and run for the hills. But things were different, weren't they, in those days? 1817, then, he led a mission westward into Cheshire. In 1819, he had established societies in many of the villages in the southwest part of Cheshire, and they were grouped around a centre called Burland, which is just to the west of Nantwich. It's a small village. It's absolutely basically a few houses and then you're through it these days. And that says something about how primitive Methodism in the area came to be. It was centred on small communities in the main. It was centred not in towns, not how we would have done it today, but it was centred in places where folk were gathered, where there were hamlets and that. These preachers then, in one sense, were concentrating on communities and populations which had been neglected by other churches. Communities and populations where the vicar or the rector was often seen as being on the side of the local squire, on the side of the landowner, where there were resentments. You remember what I was talking about, the political changes and ideas going on. And this was, I think, very much a factor in drawing people to primitive Methodist preachers. So, West Cheshire, establishment of societies. And, this is the great thing primitive Methodism actually brought, was it wasn't just the preaching, because there are lots of preachers in those days from different groups who were setting up, churches. There'd be Baptists, there'd be Independents, and they're all preaching the same gospel, more or less. But primitive Methodists, like their Wesleyan forebears, were keen on organising, putting people into groups and then uniting groups with other groups and forming a connection. This was going on in West Cheshire, but there was no official push into North Shropshire until 1822, which is when it all started. Although there were one or two small groups of primitive Methodist sympathisers, not actually established necessarily in societies, but sympathisers starting to appear in some of the North Shropshire villages even by then. So now we must move on to our next slide. And this is what Waterloo has got to do with it. Not, I'm afraid, the big battle, the big bust-up with Napoleon. No, not at all. Well, it was in a way, because on the pre-screen arm of the canal, before it got to Brook, a wharf was built, a wharfage, and a set of lime kilns. And of course, they called it Waterloo because that was the name of the month, wasn't it? Lots of places got called Waterloo in early sort of 1800s. And now on the left-hand side, you can see the existing building, which bears the name of Waterloo Wharf. And on the right-hand side is a looking back of what's left of that part of the canal. It's still got water in it. It's not navigable at this stage. It sort of ceases to be navigable about a mile further up at the marina at Wixall, but there's still water in it. Now, if you look at the canal, and this is looking back under the road bridge, I think I've got this right. On the left-hand side of the canal, which you can't see, that the level is going down, and this would be to the left-hand side of the Waterloo Wharf building, there were lime kilns. And in 1822, at Pentecost, Whitsuntide, there were some young men who decided they wanted to organise a camp meeting, you see, here in North Shropshire, by the canal, by the lime kilns. Now, I guess there was some local connection. They probably worked at the lime kilns, or this just happened to be the nearest bit of area where people, could gather. Anyhow, word got round. And word got round to the Berlin Primitive Methodist Circuit, who thought, oh gosh, we must be careful this does not become a rowdy assembly, which would cause alarm in the area. So we'd better send some good chaps along to sort of make sure it is done prim and proper, so to speak. And that then brings us to our next slide. And this man called Thomas Bateman. Now, Thomas Bateman came from the village of Chorley near Nantwich, and he was a primitive Methodist local preacher. He'd only recently been converted, in fact. Now, when the Berlin Circuit, of which Chorley was part of, heard about the goings-on at the Waterloo Wharf, they said, Thomas, you and two other people who happen to be George Taylor and John Smith. John Smith is another well-known primitive Methodist itinerant preacher. You must go and take charge of it. But you've got to walk there. So the three of them set off early in the morning from Chorley. You must be about 20 odd miles at least, walking. They hadn't been in the Scouts, these three hadn't, because they weren't prepared. They hadn't taken their umbrellas with them, because by the time they got to Whitchurch, it started to rain. and it rained on them. They got soaked, and they stopped off in Wixall at a place called Welsh End, where there were some believers who met in a cottage there, and they dried themselves off by the fire. But it wasn't a very good fire, and it took them some time. So that when they got down to Waterloo Wharf, lo and behold, this camp meeting was going already. It had started without them. Anyhow, they went along and said, look here, we're the three chaps from Berlin. We've been asked to take charge of it. And the young men who were running it said, jolly good, please do so. So they took charge of this camp meeting. And by the afternoon, a group of local youths had turned up on their horses, and they were determined to cause trouble. They surrounded the people listening to the preachers, and they were heckling. And Thomas Bateman launched his sermon at them, and he quelled them, the word of the Lord, as it were, slain these people in their tracks. And they listened rather than heckled. And several of them later on turned out to become very good primitive Methodists. But the effects of this camp meeting were enormous, and soon there were requests for preachers from all over the area. What had once been perhaps an idea was now becoming a reality, and people wanted to become part of societies. So the Berlin circuit was inundated with these requests from preachers from all over North Shropshire. And from this time onwards, the church in the area started to develop rapidly. Within a year, they had established 11 regular preaching places. And by preaching places, we are talking about cottage meetings in the main. The first chapels to be built were in Wem, and that was built by, it was a bit of an independent job. Somebody built it and then gave it to the connection as soon as they'd finished building it. They didn't ask for permission. I'm afraid there was no consents website in those days, and Manchester weren't consulted. Anyhow, but they built this chapel, and they said to the primitives, do you want it? And they said, yes, please. So that was opened by Christmas 1823, which is really sort of 18 months after the thing had started. Another chapel was built at Lower Heath. And then the following year, we had an old ice house, it was, in Oswestry converted. No, so it wasn't an ice house. It was an open-air washing place, bath house, that was it. And they had to fill in the bath area to create a platform, then had to put a roof on it. But the work in Oswestry was started through the labours of a preacher called William Doughty, who in 1822 had turned up at Bailey Head in Oswestry and started preaching, and got arrested by the bailiffs and brought before the magistrates because he had forgotten to get a licence. And so he spent a month in Shrewsbury jail, and coming out of prison, he went back to the magistrate, who was the same one who put him in prison, and said, can I have a licence, please? And the magistrate said yes, and he went back and he started Primitive Methodist Society in Oswestry, and that's how it got going. So we move on to the next slide. Now, this is very difficult to read. I do apologise, but it is a plan of the Berlin Circuit in 1823, and I'm afraid I don't think you'll be able to read from this slide the various places, but it very much encompasses Cheshire, West Cheshire, and North Shropshire. Very interesting to see the number of preaching places which had been established, and also we have the weekday plan there too. The Berlin Circuit was becoming unmanageable. It was just too big. The Shropshire work in North Shropshire was known as the Shropshire Station, but in 1825, much to the alarm of you born, it was decided to form a new circuit to control the work in North Shropshire, which spread from Oswestry in the west, would you believe it, to Longton in the Potteries, taking in places like Market Drayton. And of course, there was a bit of argy-bargies. What do you call this, you see? You know, shall we call it the Market Drayton Circuit? Shall we call it the Oswestry Circuit? No, we want to call it the Longton Circuit. So in the end, they said, right, what have we got that's actually in the middle of this area? And they came upon the little settlement at Priest Green. And so the Priest Green Circuit was formed in 1926. The society in Priest Green was not exactly big, but it was the geographical centre of the primitive Methodist world in North Shropshire. As the years went by, of course, that got broken up into smaller circuits. What we're talking about again was people building cottages, worshipping in cottages in the main. Chapels came usually a generation or so later after an awful lot of fundraising. Now, we've got some pictures on the next slide of Priest Green, the people who worshipped here. The top right, you see a barn. And this is where local history says the first primitive Methodists held their meetings. Now, this barn is a black and white building, and black and white buildings tended to go out by sometime in the 1600s. So, in other words, they were using a building which is purposing a building 200 years old. Some of the very older people in the community can remember going into it and seeing a pulpit in the corner. It is now a private house. So they then moved on and they built their first purpose-built chapel, which I think you see was 1836, which is actually the bottom left. And later on, they added the little sort of apse on the left-hand side to make the Sunday school. Now, this was okay up until about 1933, and you can just about make out it's right on a road junction there. And with the increase in motor traffic, they had to widen the road, and so they just demolished it. And there's nothing there to be seen today. It is now just grass to give a insight view from when people are coming out of the side road. And when you look at the heavy traffic thundering down the A49, which is right in front of it, you say, thank goodness for the foresight to move the church. Otherwise, you'd never be able to hear yourself preach. Traffic would be awful. So they then moved on to the building you see, which is still there today on the right-hand side. And this is Priest Green Methodist Church, which has got a very nice, tidy little graveyard in front of it. And when I went last week, all the graves had flowers on. It's well tended, and the grass is always mown to a regulation 1 centimetre height, and it's well looked after. The congregation here spend their time now worshipping one Sunday at Priest Green and one Sunday at Priest, and there's about 15 to 25 of us when we are gathered. But this is a third generation church. And that tells a story of what primitive Methodists actually settled down to do after they had moved out of their cottages. So other churches soon followed. The Ellesmere Society was formed soon after the Waterloo camp meeting, but they had difficulties in obtaining land, which was owned by the estate, which owned most of the town. But eventually they got a plot in 1840 and they built a chapel. The primitive Methodists went knocking on the door of Whitchurch, but townspeople were not really quite so receptive to these country yokels, you see. And it wasn't until 1844 that they succeeded in establishing a society in Whitchurch as the town. We move on quickly now then. Let's go to the next slide. These are membership figures for primitive Methodism in North Shropshire. And you can see from 1830, it goes from 736 to 1900 is 2,590. There are 1 or 2 reversals in the circuit figures. 1845, the total has gone down. This could be because somebody learned how to count. Also, it could be because the circuit was being divided, or circuits were being divided. I'm not quite sure. I've got a figure in 1832 in the Priest Green Circuit, there were 342 members. That suggests there's quite a few members in North Shropshire outside of Priest Green Circuit. I'm not quite sure how quite that adds up because the circuit covered most of the North Shropshire area, but I've not been able to find what a population figure would have been in these ages. But I guess, even primitive Methodism, even in the stronghold in North Shropshire, it really was a minority sport. What we do find in North Shropshire is that Methodism, primitive Methodism, continued to expand as the years went by. In many of the places in the country, it was peaking around the 1850s, but in North Shropshire, what you actually had was the increase in industrialisation in the Oswestry area, and particularly mining, because the Oswestry circuit took in Rosamedre, which is now in Wales, well, it is in Wales, but now in sort of the Welsh district, and there's a big industrial complex opening up around that area, you know, Rwabon and such places. But even by 1850s in North Shropshire, primitive Methodism was not breaking new ground. They were not setting up new societies, they were consolidating, they were building chapels, and more importantly, they were knocking down early chapels and enlarging them and making them bigger and better. So if we just move on a bit now as to who were the early primitives, if you look at baptismal records which record the occupation of fathers, 63% of fathers in North Shropshire were agricultural labourers. If you look at corresponding records in the Wesleyan Church, it was far, far fewer. 17.5% of primitive Methodists in North Shropshire were actually miners. So, you know, primitive Methodism had a big attraction, not just for agricultural workers, but also for industrial workers who lived in rural areas, I think. And I know when you go south of Shrewsbury, you look at the Stiper Stones and Snail Beach, that was a massive lead mining area and a massive stronghold of primitive Methodism. Some of the societies were very small, 4 to 5 members. They didn't have the rule of 12 in those days, didn't even have the rule of 6. We find that women played a very leading role as preachers and itinerant preachers. We find that Sunday schools played a very leading role as well, with the Sunday school superintendent often perhaps the most important person in the whole of the chapel. And certainly I think the growth of primitive Methodism was sustained in many ways through biological growth, through its Sunday school work. But I'm going to hand over now to Frances, who's going to come and just share with us briefly a case study about some of the leading women of primitive Methodism.
I want to talk a little bit in a moment about a woman called Sarah Lawley. And the only pictorial evidence I have of her is where she was buried at Butler's Bank Chapel. And as you can see on the left, that was the chapel before it was converted into a house. And I would love to know if her remains are still there or not. Who knows? That's something to find out. And at this point, I will stop, because that's the end of our slides. So we have a number of records of primitive Methodist women itinerant preachers who served in the Priest Green Circuit. 3 of them came from Bronnington in Flintshire. There was Sarah Welsh, who served for 6 months at Priest in 1826. And she reverted to local preacher status after leaving the itinerancy. And there's a whole thing there about, was it to do with marriage? Was it to do with children? Was it you know, to do with the increasing restrictions that in time were put upon women? There was Anna Stanner and Sarah Spittle, who also came from Bronnington and who served in Shrewsbury. Then there was Jane Eyre, not of Jane Eyre, but another Jane Eyre. I can't remember who wrote Jane Eyre. Isn't that terrible? Anyway, she was married to William Holiday, a joiner, and she served Priest in 1826, having her and her husband having come down from the Yorkshire Dales. And then there was Emma Quarton, who came to Priest in 1841, and we will hear a bit of her later on. Now, when it comes to Sarah Lawley, the only thing I've been able to find out about it is from her obituary. I've not been able to find anything about, at the moment, about her birth and death on the censuses. But as always, the obituaries tell us a huge amount about people. She was born in 1812 and was converted at 13 through a sermon by a John Smith, where she experienced a change in heart and mind and found peace. Subsequently, she joined our people at Hine Heath and became assistant class leader, local preacher, and occasionally, and I love this phrase, laboured in the room of a travelling preacher. Sarah was not without success. She was clearly well received across the circuit, and it's recorded that many came to know God through her preaching. Now, sadly, Sarah died in 1852, aged 40, 2 days after giving birth. We're told that the time leading up to her confinement was a time of ill health and weakness. So I imagine it was with some trepidation that she met her delivery, as her family would have. And there's a very poignant and human note comes in the obituary at this point. We're told she did not meet her end as exultant as some, but she did meet it peacefully. And I just wonder if there are expectations of what a good primitive Methodist death must have been like. Who knows? But I imagine Sarah must have carried so many concerns, and her family would, about this incredibly late pregnancy, 40 years of age in those days, giving birth. I mean, today it's, you know, considered to be a more mature age to give birth. So she must have carried so many anxieties, and anxieties about what might happen to the child if it survived, who would care for it. And it's important to notice that women preachers had this unimaginable task of constant childbearing and child rearing, and it's not surprising that many were either left voluntarily or were forced from itinerancy, like Sarah Welsh, on the marriage or the birth of a subsequent child. And as primitive Methodism became more respectable, women were squeezed out of the pulpit into restrictive domesticity. And I'm very grateful to both Tim and Jill Baker for their chapters in Women Preachers and Methodists. I think it was Jill who talks about how the Victorians loved their angels of the home, which is where women were confined to in a particular role. How many of the primitive Methodist women died in childbirth would be an illuminating and a sad study to make. I know in the book Women Preachers and Methodists, a number of women have been recorded as dying in childbirth. We don't know anything directly about Sarah's economic or family circumstances, but there's every chance, as John would have said, that there's it would have been hard living, and poverty was never too far away. And maybe her family and her husband were either agricultural labourers or miners. Sarah died at Muckleton Bank and was buried at Butler's Bank Chapel, as in the screen, on the 14th of May. Now, the obituary ends rather curiously. It says, her death on the 16th of May, oh no, that's got to be the wrong way. Oh no, her death on the 16th of May was improved by the writer of the obituary, can't remember his name, and two professed to obtain salvation. So again, was there a disappointment that Sarah did not breathe some last words of faith and assurance as she passed from this world into the next, and that perhaps these two conversions made up for it? I don't know. That would be interesting to look at more. So Sarah joined, going back to a 13-year-old girl, she joined our folks at Hine Heath. So what do we know about Hine Heath? And the answer is not a lot. A map of 1880 reveals a chapel and a graveyard at the end of a track which meets the road to Hodnett, but this chapel was built after Sarah died. The other end of the track, which was coming off a very minor road, John and I walked along for a little while, and the little track was tantalisingly called Chapel Lane. Very little was revealed apart from a building at the end of that bit of the track that had some old stonework in, which may very well have been used as a Methodist gathering place. And I'm willing it to be Sarah's spiritual home, but I can't say with any certainty. Now, the area of Hine Heath is not very far from Stanton upon Hine, and this is a village which has historically been extremely significant since Roman times. And I guess Hine Heath was probably just that, a heath, and there's one or two marl pits identified where, you know, clay was extracted to make bricks. Looking again at the religious census of 1851, it was noted that in North Shropshire there were 158 places of primitive Methodist worship, 48% of which were permanent buildings, 34% houses, and 18% were temporary accommodation. 4/5 dated from the 1830s to the 1840s, so I suspect there's a very good chance that Sarah's first spiritual home was a small gathering place in a cottage or a barn. Now, like any other primitive Methodist circuit, Priest Green had its own particular goings-on recorded in the quarterly meeting. While preaching for conversion, while preaching was always for conversion, the phrase was raised at the quarterly meeting, the phrase that sinners in hell would have fire and brimstone for breakfast, dinner and supper was regarded as improper and not to be used by preachers. One's attire also came under close scrutiny. The quarterly meeting directed that somebody should speak to a particular brother about his hair not conforming to the rule, and a certain sister, who turns out to be our Emma Quarton, a lace maker from Nottingham. Thank you, Tim. I think you raised that in your chapter, which was very helpful. Emma Quarton did not conform to the rules of plain dress with regard to her cap, watchguard and bag. Now, clearly, this sister was something of a rebel. She didn't alter her attire, and it was requested that a young man be sent instead. And as Tim points out in his chapter, perhaps there was a bit too much Nottingham lace tucked away there. We're nearly done. Breaking the Sabbath was also strictly taboo and would be brought to the notice of the quarterly meeting. 1 Minute records that a particular brother broke the Sabbath by offering a reward for a stolen plank during the means of grace at his house. Clearly, the means of grace didn't cover plank theft in the appointed hour. So I would just love to have been a fly on the wall in these meetings. We would have learnt so much and been so enriched. And I suspect that some of the circuit meetings I've attended look tame in comparison with what went on in the Priest Green Primitive Methodist quarterly meeting. And we conclude. Oh, John, just quickly.
Yeah. They do say, don't they, with your family history, you pay so much to have it uncovered, and then you pay an awful lot more to cover it up, because some of the stuff they find is not always what you want to be published. But then, so this is the story of primitive Methodism here in North Shropshire, a revival movement, a well-organised revival movement, a movement that offered people the vision of not just, the hope of heaven, but a better life here and now. A movement which stressed education, which stressed fellowship, which was actually quite exciting. I think that word has got to be said. You're part of a movement bigger than just happening in your community. This was happening all over the place, and you're constantly hearing stories of new ground being broken through the Primitive Methodist magazine. Sobriety, thrift, a better life. That really was what was on offer. But like all revival movements, it settled down behind the walls of chapels, and people wanted social status, so they wanted better chapels built. And in the end, primitive Methodism looked not much different from Wesleyan's. And so, as you all know, in 1932, it was really game over, and we decided that the streams would flow into a mighty river, and the trickle of which is still with us today. And I think with those words, I will conclude and hand back over.
Thank you. I'm sorry, we've gone longer than we expected. That's the worst thing, isn't it?
Thank you so much, John. And